Good morning and bon dia if you're in the Americas, and good afternoon or bon tard if you're in Europe or Africa. Today, we start the exciting 4 days of thematic sessions tied to the Air Center's missions. Each day, we will have a plenary session followed by concurrent sessions. First, today we have a plenary session, Blue Economy for Post-Pandemic Recovery, which will be moderated by McCann. After this important session, we will have sessions running concurrently. So there'll be 4 sessions today. The first session on marine spatial planning and coastal pollution begins at 10:30 EDT or 14:30 UTC. The last exciting sessions will cover mangroves and coastal processes. They will start at 12 noon EDT or 1600 UTC. So let's begin with the very first session with McCann. Enjoy your day.
Thank you very much, Greg. So thank you. My name is Jennifer McCann, and I'm with the University of Rhode Island Coastal Resources Center. I'm part of the Graduate School of Oceanography. And thank you very much for having me moderate the plenary session, Blue Economy for Post-Pandemic Recovery. Today, we're going to hear from 4 organizations that have been engaging in this post-pandemic recovery, preparing businesses and communities and countries to pivot into this new way of doing business and sustaining our world. So again, we have 4 panelists. Miguel Marques from Portugal, who's representing PwC, Gregory Watson, who's representing the Inter-American Development Bank. We have Erik from the UN Global Compact, and then we have Claire Jolly from the Organization for Economic Co-Cooperation and Development. And with that, let's start the presentations. Miguel, we're going to start with you. Miguel, I know you have some PowerPoint, so you're in control. We're going to hold.
Thank you so much, Jen, and I will share my screen in a minute.
And we will be holding questions until after all panelists have presented.
Okay, I hope my slides are seen by everyone. So good afternoon or good morning, depending on which continent are you. Well, I will speak about the blue economy, and I divided my presentation in 2 parts. One is before the pandemic, and the second part is during the pandemic and how we can expect the post-pandemic. So before the pandemic, we were observing a huge growth on the activity on oceans. You know that in the blue economy, time flows differently than normal. We consider in PwC that short time is 5 years. So in this diagram, we have 20 years of the evolution of the blue economy in the past 2 decades. And we can see, by looking to the dots, that there was a huge leap on the activity on ocean in all industries. But unfortunately, this huge growth that was happening was and is too much concentrated in some points on ocean. So there is a kind of an unbalanced use of the ocean. And we can see that 3 countries in Asia represent more than 80% of shipbuilding, 2 countries in Europe, more than 60% of world offshore renewable wind, 4 countries in Asia represent more than 80% of vessel demolition. The 2 regions of Caribbean and Mediterranean represent more than half of all cruise dynamics, and 3 countries in Asia represent more than 70% of world aquaculture measured in quantity. So if we put all these dynamics in a map, we can see the intense use of ocean in Asia, also a bit in Europe, and less in the other parts of the world. But of course, we are looking in terms of very big numbers. And we can see by the gray areas in the ocean that this concentrated use of the ocean is causing problems. Plastic islands, but more than that, extensive coastal pollution that we can see all in the shores of India and Asia. The red line on this represent huge coastal pollution. And now this was before the COVID-19. During COVID-19, there was a strong break on all economic activities in the world. We can look to what was saying the IMF in October 2019. The title was Global Manufacturing Downturn. So there was signs before the pandemic that there was approaching an economic crisis worldwide. In January, they say tentative stabilization, and in April 2020, they say the great lockdown, and in June 2020, they say a crisis like no other, an uncertain recovery. So this is what we are living in today. We are in a huge crisis, and there is a lot of uncertainty about the recovery. So everything we say today can change in the near future. But let's look by region and particularly to the Atlantic. This is what IMF projects in terms of what will happen in terms of the GDP growth on 2020 and before and after that. So we can see that, for instance, in Eurozone, in 2019, the growth was about 1%, which is not a huge growth. This is a sign that things were not okay in the economics. But for 2020 is projected a decline of about 10%, which is huge. The same happens with the Americas, the north part with 2.3%, and for 2020 -8%, and in the south part of the Americas from 0% of growth to -9%. And even in Asia, we will have in 2020 negative numbers. So industry by industry, tourism was the first to be affected, and it will be the last to recover, because there will be the need to regain trust, and also families need to recover their financial stress because of the crisis. But this is a very important industry if we want to rebalance the blue economy, because not only because of crisis, but also because of the digital transformation that is going on, we need some sectors that are that can absorb manpower and the time of human beings, and tourism was doing that. So if it is under a huge crisis, this is difficult, and it is critical if we want a sustainable future. So it is important that we help this industry, because it is critical for mankind to have contact, direct contact with ocean without overuse it. Another industry like maritime transport that is completely linked with what happens with global trade. And we can see in this chart the huge drop on the global trade. Here also is critical if we want that post-pandemic is a sustainable recovery. If we don't get sustainable trade agreements, we will not have a sustainable blue economy. So it is fundamental that post-recovery means sustainable trading agreements. And we know by the news that before pandemic, trading agreements were a hot topic. At the moment, continue to be a very hot topic, and we need to cool down this topic in order that we can sit on a table and really agree on sustainable trading agreements. Of course, all the shipping industry was affected with the slowdown of the global trade. However, we have to congratulate to all seafarers that never stopped. I'm not aware of any big port, maritime port that has stopped, and that was fundamental to reduce COVID impact in the economy. Another important industry is shipbuilding. We consider that shipbuilding is an infrastructural industry on the blue economy. And for us, it is a kind of a barometer of the new blue economy. Because before the pandemic, shipbuilding was too much concentrated on 3 countries in Asia. And if it continues that way, it means that the unbalanced use of ocean, it will continue. We can see by the order book that there is a huge decline on orders. So it is fundamental that we recover on that, and that we use this moment to transform our shipbuilding industry and to have a more sustainable ships, and more than that, that we have more countries on this field, and also on the demolition field. It's not sustainable that all over the world we send ships to Pakistan and other countries to be demolished. If we want to grow with the blue economy, we also must be responsible to, in our countries, be able to do the shipbuilding, the ship demolition in a sustainable way. So we consider this a barometer of the future. And in terms of seafood, we can see that the COVID-19 was able to change the mix of seafood consumption. People started to consume low price seafood goods. This is going to change after COVID, but this means that it is possible to change the mix of consumption. So if it is possible to change the mix of consumption, we believe that is also possible to change this mix for a most sustainable consumption on seafood.
You have a little bit less than a minute.
Okay, so I will conclude by listing some of the opportunities we say. We put on board the rebalance of global trade and the nurture of international cooperation. Without these 2 opportunities being fulfilled, we will not have sustainable recovery. So we must be able to sit on a table, cooperate in order to rebalance global trade. And then we also have the opportunities of upgrade our health systems, and the blue economy can help on that. We have the opportunity to continue to the digital transformation, but consider more and more ethics. If not, we will have future problems on that. We should take a decision based on knowledge, so we can use this moment to help and invest research and knowledge. And of course, we must invest on the climate pacts and the Green Deal for an economic, social, and environmental sustainability, and respect the differences, the different cultures. So there is not a single strategy, a single optimal strategy. It's fundamental that we consider different cultures on the strategy, so the global strategy to the post-pandemic must reflect the specificities of the different cultures. And I will conclude this way. Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. Appreciate that. We're going to move right into Gregory Watson. Gregory, I know you don't have any PowerPoint, so we'll just, let's move.
Take it away. Great. Thank you so much. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here. For those who don't know the IDB, we are the Regional Development Bank for Latin America and the Caribbean. And so we fund both public and private sector projects that governments and private sector bring forward across a vast range of activities. And obviously in the COVID and eventually post-COVID era, we're going to be supporting the economic growth and recovery of the different countries. What I'm going to talk about today is more a bit granular about what we're seeing from countries and some of the solutions that we think might fit into a recovery. And if I start, and this echoes very well from Miguel's presentation, when we are talking to different countries in the region, they're expressing various concerns to us. Ecotourism reduction is clearly one of them. And then considering even the knock-on effects of this beyond just the impact to the tourism providers, but the impacts to the supply chain of those tourism providers, but also in many cases, the ecotourism, especially in coastal areas, is related to protected areas, national parks, which are not receiving those user fees that traditionally would be used to actually fund the conservation work of governments in all sectors, but particularly in the blue economy. And so there's a large hole in national budgets to actually cover some of these activities that maybe in the past would be covered. Another concern that we're hearing from countries and from communities is that with a huge economic downturn, you may see overexploitation of fish stocks as local populations who live on the coast, who in the past would have had income to purchase food, would actually start to fish for feeding their families. And that's actually another concern that we're hearing. And so moving on to kind of how we're looking at and integrating nature, blue economy into the recovery, I think I would start by talking about the real importance of mapping different plans. It's very hard to mobilize capital specifically for biodiversity, natural capital projects, especially from a government in a time of scarcity. And so if we're looking to foment a blue recovery, it's really going to be about mapping the blue economy action plans, priorities of a government against national infrastructure plans, national NDCs for climate, national recovery plans if they're written yet for COVID, and all of the various different kind of permutations of national planning to find those projects that can be a triple win in terms of income generation, employment, and environmental impact. And that requires a lot of planning. It requires a lot of capacity building. It's not just the remit of the Ministry of Environment. You need to involve ministries of finance, ministries of planning. And so we're trying to support countries as they do this. And Costa Rica is a really good example of a country that has a blue economy plan that had been working on pre-COVID, that now is supporting the kind of incorporation of the recovery and income generation and coastal livelihoods in the wide range of values, from resilience to fishing to ecotourism and beyond, is important. I would also say that for us, looking at nature-based solutions is key. Again, linking to this idea that you have multiple benefits in one project. We have supported many nature-based solutions projects in the past, and we try to always make that value case. For example, we're working with the countries of the MAR Fund, which is the kind of Caribbean eastern coast with the reef, Mesoamerican reef, to develop insurance products for the reef, where the reef is insured as natural infrastructure. And so in this way, you're actually channeling private capital to your conservation and restoration activities without having to really hit the public balance sheet particularly hard. When we look at nature-based solutions, in particular, our sustainable infrastructure program, working with the biodiversity team, has issued 2 reports. They're on our website. One of them is an analysis of the challenges of nature-based solutions. And really what we found is mainstreaming into policy at the very high level is important. Looking at tenders, how can you incorporate the evaluation of nature-based solutions in tenders, in planning? A real need for tools and methodologies. It's very hard to assess. If we had a workshop with engineers where they said, we would love to consider mangroves in part of a hybrid green-gray solution, but our cost-benefit, Excel sheets that we use for all of our projects don't provide us the opportunity to quantify the CapEx and the OpEx of the mangroves. How can you help us do that? And it's something that we've been working on, but it's very illustrative of the kinds of challenges that you have when dealing with nature-based solutions, which is just that it's important to quantify and fit this into the tools. Also to make the case to project developers that by incorporating nature-based solutions, they may be able to tap into climate funds, biodiversity funds, concessional funds that might make projects more bankable. We've also seen, like I mentioned, defining the business case, but scalability is always a challenge. And how do we aggregate many projects together in order to make something that's really attractive to investors? A second report that we did actually is targeted towards those project developers and has 12 steps for how project developers can incorporate these topics and also some examples. And obviously, when we're talking about nature-based solutions, blue economy and coastal areas is the bulk. You know, and another example of this is, I think, a project we recently approved in Panama, which again started before COVID, but is beginning to execute post kind of the beginning of COVID. And this is to incorporate mangroves into the NDC of the country, and also to create financing mechanisms for mangrove ecosystems in urban areas, because I think we need to remember that, at least for us at the bank, we're not just talking about rural populations here. And it's, again, what this project does is work with the airport, the water treatment authority, the coastal landholders, the fishermen, everybody who receives some sort of benefit from the coastal ecosystem to build a broad-based coalition to basically pressure government action on protecting these coastal assets, because you can actually make the case that they're generating tremendous value. You know, if I move on to kind of thinking about how do you finance all of this, because it's not always public finance or the finance from a development bank, we've seen that on the one hand, you have entrepreneurs and businesses with really good ideas. You know, that insurance model I was talking about is one, but they require risk capital. And we see that there's a lot of you know, accelerators, incubators from public sector, from science organizations, from NGOs that get a business or an idea to a certain spot. And then on the other side, we have many, many investment funds that are interested in this topic coming from Europe. The IADB, I led the investment of the IADB into the Althelia Sustainable Ocean Fund, which, you know, is seeking these kinds of projects. But there's a missing middle in the between of finance where, you know, you need $500,000 to $1 million for something that's already proven its concept, but can't really absorb debt, doesn't really need a guarantee, probably can't absorb large equity. So you need convertible grants, contingent-based payment loans, simple agreements for future equity. And I think that's a really important segment here. And that's where public money and grants can really help to seed those kinds of models. So you transform the grant into a risk-loving financial instrument. I think also you look at what countries are starting to do with their kind of natural capital trust funds, conservation trust funds. In our region, you know, Chile has started to look at creating a conservation trust fund for marine protected areas. We see in Barbados that they've created a ministry of blue economy. And I think that part of the role of institutions like us is to strengthen those efforts as much as possible so that we're really starting to build these broad-based coalitions. And if I would close with my remarks with kind of any message, for me, that's really the message, is that when we're talking about a blue economy or even a green economy with biodiversity, but here on blue, this is a broad-based holistic approach. And it's not just looking at one sector because everything is interlinked. And so if you don't have the public and private sectors working together, the Ministry of Finance working with the Ministry of Environment, working with the Ministry of Infrastructure, it's very hard to reach, I'd say, a systematically important change in this sector. And so as we, as you know, a community here that's interested in the blue economy, try to move this forward, I think that that is the key that we've learned in doing this work at the IADB. So I'll close there and thank you.
Great, thank you, Gregory. That was very interesting. We're going to move to Erik, and Erik does not have PowerPoints either. So thanks, Erik.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you to everybody. So far, I think this is very interesting and very timely. Let me just give you a brief background about our work at the UN Global Compact. The UN Global Compact is the private sector arm of the UN. Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, is our chairman, but the board is mainly made up by representatives from the private sector. We have about 10,000 companies, 4,000 civil society members throughout the world. We have local networks on all continents. And we were founded 20 years ago this year by Kofi Annan. So it's our anniversary as well as the UN's this year. The main foundation for the UN Global Compact is the 10 principles covering environmental, social, labor rights, and anti-corruption and transparency. Those 10 principles are foundational to whatever we do. Then, of course, we have also a special role when it comes to private sector and the 17 SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think in this COVID-19 pandemic situation we are in now, it's very important to have long-term ambitions and goals. And we think that the SDGs still are not only very relevant, they are the most relevant guiding tools that we can use now, both as governments and private sector actors. Because the pandemic is an enormous stress factor to the economy, to companies, to individuals, and coming together and working together, as we know in goal number 17, is a key enabler of actually solving this crisis. Now, 3 years ago, we started the Sustainable Ocean Business Action Platform at the UN Global Compact, where we gathered all the key industrial stakeholders in shipping, in seafood, in offshore energy, and science, and the UN system. And myself, I was coming from the shipping sector, working in the international shipping community, and we very soon after the release of the UN Sustainable Development Goals understood that the industry really need to address this. So our work was about identifying what can the industry do and what should the industry not do. What are the wrong solutions and what are the good solutions? So I've been working for the UN 3 years now, and we have made a roadmap to 2030. And I think this is equally important in the pandemic, and we're reflecting some of the stress factors that we see in the pandemic. We know that to reach the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, while complying with the 10 principles of the UN Global Compact, we need to ensure more sustainable seafood for a growing population. We need to decarbonize shipping. We need green and zero emission shipping. We need to harness all the potential electricity in the ocean. We know that offshore wind really can power all electricity demand today if we do it right. We need to end waste entering the ocean. And finally, we need to map the ocean. We know very little. And that's very encouraging with the Air Center and these forums to really start collaborating on this. What we see going forward in the short term, because of the pandemic, is that some of these sectors are experiencing very different impact on by the pandemic in their daily routines. Shipping is, of course, the most hardly impact. Today we know that more than 400,000 crew members, seafarers, are stranded at sea, and 300,000 are stranded on shore, but are not able to go to their vessels. This is a critical moment, actually, because many port authorities still have not taken into account the recommendations from the IMO, ICS, ourselves, and the broader ocean community to recognize seafarers as key workers. Even though the port opened for them to actually do crew change, many of these ports, of course, can't be practically used because there are no international air connections. So there are a number of challenges for the shipping community. I think Greg showed it, Miguel showed it in a very good way, that prior to the pandemic, the shipping industry has been suffering for years. That's not been a very financial, viable sector, and it's really ripe for a structural change. We think that will happen anyway because the need of green shipping will need a total transformation of this industry. And that will not come from the industry within. We think it will come from external factors and disruptors, new industry players that can come from not the regular Northern Europe part where shipping has been very heavy, but it can actually come from other places as well. So it's a new game opening up. We see in seafood that it's doing quite well actually during the pandemic through the figures that we are seeing. Frozen food is the new normal for advanced aquaculture, but also regular aquaculture, because the transport is of course no longer airborne, but shipping based, and therefore you need to freeze the food. We also see, of course, in the offshore energy sector that the oil and gas sector is extremely hard hit with a crash in the oil prices earlier this year, but offshore wind is doing very good because it's very long-term investment based, and things are really moving fast in that segment. So these are the three main industries that we are looking at. I think waste management, wastewater industry is also extremely interesting case, but we don't have any real insights on the challenges apart from all the plastic now surging in the cities from the mouth covers. But the three main drivers of the blue economy on food, energy, and shipping, we think they will grow substantially towards the 2030. And the pandemic might actually be a catalyzer for that growth if we do it right. So together with partners in IADB and others, we have been working on a blue bond framework. It was the first public paper was launched in May. I can share the link with you afterwards. And we are now working for a practical guide how to issue a blue bond for corporates, for municipalities and governments. We all know the Seychelles blue bonds from last year, but we now see an enormous appetite in the corporate side to issue blue bonds because they need to finance this extremely costly transition into green shipping. They want to expand the sustainable parts of the seafood industry, and they want to expand offshore wind farms. And the green bond framework and sustainable KPI bond framework from ICMA is a good cornerstone for bond issuance, but it doesn't really recognize the key enablers of sustainable blue economy. And that's why we have been issuing these framework documents to really have an anchor in the bond taxonomy to recognize what are the positive and sustainable good impacts of new bond issuance and new projects within the blue economy. This will be, there will be already be launched a corporate blue bond in a couple of weeks from a shipping company. We see ports, we see offshore wind farms now looking at the blue bonds as a part of their finance structure. And the encouraging part of this is that we also see a surge in green bonds after April, after the pandemic really took hold of the global economy. We still see a growing interest in green bonds and sustainability-linked bonds. So I think that is extremely encouraging. And in our group of ocean-related companies, we also have the biggest banks in the world. We have the biggest pension funds in the world and private equity funds. And they say very clearly, we can't get enough green bonds, sustainability bonds, and we want the blue bonds, because all these institutional investors have to de-risk their portfolio, and with the pandemic as an additional risk, they want to at least be very clear that they have a good ESG or SDG linked portfolio. And I think it's the job of the UN Global Compact and organizations like your own out there to help the financial community qualify the blue economy. Because it's not very easy. It's a very complex, small scale fisheries, mangrove projects, seaweed growth for CCS. You have high-end industry salmon farming, which have positive and negative sides. What companies are doing the right things and what companies are doing the wrong things. I think we are actually in the midst of the pandemic, we're really at a very interesting crossroad to make the right decisions. And I think it's very encouraging in these days where the politics are getting more polarized, global national cooperation is getting uneven. global cooperation is getting tighter and better and more transparent. And that is, I think it's the best way to sum up our perspectives on the pandemic. The governments are struggling. They're paying extreme attention, of course, to their own health response. Global cooperation is mainly targeted by the corporate side and the financial side. And that enables actually a lot of opportunity for the new blue economy that really has to flourish the next 9 years towards 2030. So thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, couldn't get my mute button there. So thank you very much, Erik. And we're going to move to Claire, who has a PowerPoint. And I see we're getting some questions. Please, again, put your questions in the question box on the web page. So, and we will have a good discussion after Claire's presentation.
Hi, Jen, thanks very much. I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation. And I do have some slides because I'm from the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and we tend to love graphs. So I will have the pleasure of sharing here some findings from the OECD on how we see the sustainable ocean economy for a post-pandemic world. We have been working on the ocean economy at the OECD for the past 7 years, and we're seeing many changes in terms of the growing high-level political interest in the ocean, as testified by yesterday's ministerial panel, the number and wider diversity of ocean economic activities, and in the technological changes that we are seeing with new business models. And of course, the COVID-19 crisis happened. So I will start with here a few definitions that we are using at the OECD for measurement purposes. For us, the ocean economy has two pillars when we attempt to measure it. The first is really the ocean-based economic activities, like ocean-based industries that Erik referred to, and the crucial marine ecosystems that provide both life-sustaining services, like carbon capture, and critical assets that many economic sectors rely on, like fish and minerals, obviously. So sustainability has been really, I would say, a key topic for us ever since the beginning. And this sustainability has really 3 dimensions that are listed here: economic, environmental, and social. I'll come back to these dimensions a bit later, but really to get to a virtual circle, and as we are thinking of the recovery after the pandemic, these 3 dimensions should actually be way more looked into. I'll come back to that. Maybe a few words on how we measure this ocean economy. One crucial element, I think, that a few of my co-panelists mentioned already is the importance of the ocean economy for a number of countries. This is the result of a recent work that we conducted with new ocean-based industries data sets, where we found that indeed, when you look at countries by income groups, high income all the way to really low income country groups, you really find this dependence for quite a number of countries, particularly in low middle income and low income countries, for a number of ocean-based industries. Here are just 6 ocean-based industries, but typically marine fisheries sectors are critically important for quite a number of actors. Tourism, obviously, especially in the Caribbean and Pacific islands, can sometimes represent up to 20% of GDP for some of these countries. So when we're talking about the ocean economy, and I think Miguel mentioned it well also in his presentation, we see this really depending on where you're looking at, this dependence on the ocean economy. And obviously, when the COVID-19 crisis started just a few months ago, when you think of it, entire sectors were really impacted, affecting more or less different countries. Here, I'm just sharing some figures that we had published already back 4 years ago in terms of projections. We had identified 10 sectors, particularly maritime and coastal tourism, port activities, and offshore wind, as showing great prospects for the next 15 years. And obviously, in terms of value added, they were growing very fast. But this acceleration, obviously, had also some very strong impacts. The challenges were building up in terms of the ocean health. And when you look at the situation now, quite a number of sectors were obviously very affected. Erik mentioned that also in his presentation. Marine and coastal tourism really came almost to a naught in almost every countries. Port activities also suffered quite a lot. In terms of other sectors, I would say the crisis actually impacted them for a few weeks or few months, but we're seeing some very strong recovery for some of the sectors. And let me mention maybe just one in terms of the shipping industry with the container shipping sector, which is seeing since the past couple of months, very strong growth again, particularly because of the demand coming from retail store in the US and Western Europe. Basically, they need to build up their stocks again. And we are seeing, again, long-term trends already appearing now when we still are in the midst of the pandemic, with the needs for food, energy, leisure, retail, and transport. The pressures that we had already identified a few years ago and that we keep hearing about, they will come back, I think, even stronger if we're not careful in the way we actually rebuild and support the industry. And I think the UN Global Compact here is playing a very crucial role with the industry players. Another part of the activities that we are looking at, particularly in the OECD, is this growing importance of evidence on the ocean health and the type of infrastructure, research infrastructure that need to be put in place or supported in order to provide even more evidence to actually build better, rebuild, I would say, this ocean economy. The growing importance of ocean observing systems is getting better recognized, we believe. And the Atlantic countries have done, I think, a great job in indeed creating networks of cooperation, transatlantic cooperation networks, in order to actually build up the infrastructure. But there are still many gaps in the type of data that we need collectively, and particularly to measure the impacts of the an accelerating ocean economy. And here on this graph, you will see, for instance, the needs from the research community in terms of biology and ecosystems data. We still have a way to go in terms of the technological readiness levels that are needed to actually indeed get a better sense of the ocean health from local to global. And that's where we're seeing this key role of science, technology, and innovation. See, that's a bit of a different angle from the previous presentations in terms of responding to the challenges of this growing ocean economy. It's going to grow again. We need indeed science to actually sustain quite a number of the activities themselves, but also in terms of measuring the impacts and feeding new regulations down the road. So I listed here a number of key roles, and let me just mention this importance of the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development that will be actually starting a few months from now for the next 10 years. We are seeing here many opportunities for countries, particularly along the Atlantic coasts, to actually build up new projects in the larger programs of this UN Decade to actually get to more sustainable ocean sectors. And let me maybe finish here with some good news in terms of the improved evidence, not only scientific, but improved evidence on how we measure the ocean economy and its activities. We never have seen so many efforts to actually try to get a better sense of the ecosystem services. And here our colleague from the International Bank, Gregory, mentioned this importance of natural-based capital. We are seeing much more research specifically on these items. At the OECD, we're working particularly on the statistical measurement of industries. We are working on satellite accounts for the ocean economy with more than a dozen countries right now, where we do believe that building up time series data will help not only decision makers in these industries themselves, but also policymakers as they actually aim to get to improved regulations, improved policy to foster not only innovation, but also more sustainable ocean activities. So I think we are at a crucial time where we do have a chance to indeed make things better. We do have a chance to get better evidence on the ocean health, better evidence on the economic impacts of this ocean economy, but also, I would say, improved guidance. We see here in this panel, I think, a very good representation of some of the organizations that will make a difference in terms of funding, in terms of corporate guidance, and in terms, obviously, of economic evidence, hopefully. So thanks for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to the discussions. Thanks, Jen.
Great. Thank you very much, Claire. Again, thank you very much. These are amazing presentations, really appreciated them. I wanted to, we have a few questions from their larger audience. One in particular, there's two that are similar in that, you know, people are wondering if already there are examples of where the blue economy is helping in the post-pandemic economic recovery. So, you know, many of us are talking about, well, when the pandemic ends, but do we have some concrete examples right now of where the blue economy has, and also a sustainable blue economy has contributed or is adding value to a community or a nation or a region? That's an open question. Claire.
So maybe not going as far as a sustainable ocean economy, because the shipping sector has still a bit of a long way to go to get totally sustainable. But I would say the shipping sector, and I mentioned container shipping in particular, is playing right now, this very minute, a crucial role in actually providing medical cargo all across the world. In terms of the masks, this particular sector is really playing a key role in sustaining also the economies, the retail sectors in quite a large number of countries around the world. So there, the ocean economy has always played a key role for the global economy. But today, the big challenge is to make it more sustainable, less harmful to the environment, and to be more inclusive, I would say, so that countries, populations actually in different countries can benefit more from this growth. So that's really the challenge here, environmentally sustainable and socially sustainable. That's going to be the next step. That's where we really need to rebuild the economy better.
Thank you, Claire. Erik?
Yeah, for, you know, as an example, we might also add that we see that seaweed actually and biological research from sea biochemistry is a key ingredient in the remdesivir medical treatment. Actually, President Trump was receiving here the other day. We'll still have to wait to see if it works, but it's a very big industry, medical research and ocean genome, and we see that you know, scientists, they tell us that every second specimen they take up from the sea levels below 3,000 meters, every second specimen is new to them. So there is enormous treasure chest in the sea when it comes to biological research and the potential for new medicines and new cures from the sea. So that is actually, we can already see that changing some of the investment landscape in the private sector, also for these research companies. Of course, there's a huge interest in all companies that are directly related to the pandemic, but also these long-term investment research companies are now getting real interest because these are new insights and the ocean is full of them. So I think that is a good point. Also to what Claire said, I think, and it was addressed by the others as well, the coastal communities, of course, the tourism part is gone, but we see that the need for more resilient local economies where fisheries will be a more core component is increasingly important, but it should be regulated well so you don't experience rapid overfishing or IUU at this time where we really don't need it.
Great. And just to point out, some seaweeds, I'm not sure if all, help to filter the water and clean the water. So that's a sort of a economic, productivity and also an opportunity to care for our resources. All right. There's one other question that I'd like to bring up. I'm not, we've heard of technologies, infrastructures, bonds, and other ways of moving the blue economy forward. How can emerging economies participate in the inclusive blue economy if they rarely have access to technology, infrastructures, funding, and more importantly, adequate human capital? All right, Gregory, I'm glad you raised your hand on that one.
If I didn't, I think maybe I would lose my job. I would turn the question around a little bit because I actually think that in many of the developing economies, we see a stronger embrace and understanding, at least definitely in some local communities, but in some governments as well, of the role of the blue economy in their overall GDP, but also to the livelihoods of their people. And so I think we do have the barriers of capacity, we do have the barriers of finance and models, but I take Barbados as an example, which created a Ministry of Blue Economy specifically to look at these issues, that is at the cabinet level. And so I think that, when you are in a developing country, you don't have the luxury actually of kind of turning away from this sector. You have to look at these issues. And I also think that there's in many cases more willingness to experiment on different types of models. We see the Nature Conservancy, for example, working on the concept of resilience bonds and that are, slightly different from a blue bond and resilience credits. We've been working on stock exchanges for the value of nature, where you can do this for those untradables and those non-market value streams that Claire was talking about. And it tends to be in the smaller countries, the countries that recognize this value, where you're actually able to get more traction on these. And I think it's part of our job as institutions like a development bank to finance and to fund with concessional capital or with grants some of that capacity building.
Okay. Erik?
I think this is a very, very important topic. I hope that we can see a greater public-private partnership on this, because with technology, you can scale down solutions as well. So you can have floating offshore wind parks, which can actually be deployed more at places, small island states, etc. You can have smaller scalable fish farms, but with high quality and high technology, where you can have tech assistance from remote. You don't need all the expertise at the site. So hopefully we can find new ways of expanding high-end solutions to smaller markets. And I think there is a real appetite for that. I've been visiting countries in Africa, Caribbean, and Latin America discussing this, and they are very educating themselves to meet that the gap, and I think the technology, global technology exchange we have today and the knowledge exchange we have today, these assets will be easily obtainable at a smaller government level and smaller corporate level throughout the world, only in a few years from now. That's what we see, at least. I think some of the old industries like shipping is still very hard to enter, but some of these new industries is easier. There's a more lower barrier to enter that market, basically.
Great, thank you. We have another, what I'm being encouraged to do, just so you know what I'm doing, is I am looking at the questions from the live chat, and then in about 10 minutes, I will be then changing to the Q&A in this Zoom chat room. So that is what I've been encouraged to do. The next question, I think, is starting to direct to Claire, and I'm going to put my own little spin on it. The question is about science and the blue economy, and I would like to expand that to university involvement and the blue economy and innovation. And Claire, maybe we could start with you, and if others would like to talk about this, is science and innovation and the blue economy, when duplicated and become engaged with each other, the result will be flourished and progress will occur. How can we make an engagement between them in the scientific fields? Or how can we get, what is the role of universities? And I know all science doesn't come from the universities, but me being from a university, how can universities be more engaged in both the science aspect, but also the innovation aspect?
Oh, it's a great question. We've been looking at what we call the knowledge and innovation networks, specifically in the ocean economy, for the past 3 years or so. And actually, we're going to have a workshop specifically on these networks in North America. And it's going to take place in late November. It was supposed to take place in Halifax in Canada, but we're going to do it virtually, so anyone can join. Specifically on these knowledge and innovation networks that are basically new ways of having academia working with public research centers and industries. And we're seeing all these networks that have often been born from former industry clusters, or that have actually emerged from just bilateral cooperation between public research centers and universities to sort of really form new types of interactions. We see this with the supercluster in Canada. We see this with Campus Mondial de la Mer in Brest. We see this in Korea. We are seeing this, obviously, this is really born, I would say, from history. In California with Scripps Institute, with a number of universities, really new ways of actually interacting and working together. And this is really born from these new challenges and this new interest, I would say, from public authorities with new demands. This plus the digitalization and the development of new products that I would say nobody thought about, or very few thought about 30 years ago, in terms of small ROVs, new cables that can actually have so many sensors. You do have this perfect storm, I would say, of advances in technologies, interest from policymakers, and interest from commercial entities. And this is the foundation for many of these innovation networks. And I do really believe that universities, particularly if they do have some marine research programs, should get engaged with many of these networks. Don't wait up, really get to know who's doing what and try to get involved. There are so many projects and programs that will take place over the next decade. It's really the time to actually get involved. Everybody has something to bring to these partnerships.
So how do they get involved? And I'm thinking of small island communities, for example, or countries versus the United States. So how would you, if someone from a small island country is listening, how would you recommend that they get engaged? Can you be a little bit more specific?
So I would have two examples. The first one is to engage via, I would say, international programs like the Commonwealth program for the blue economy, where they've been putting together a lot of networking between UK research centers and small island states. So that's usually governmental-led programs. The other type of way to reach out is to actually get in touch directly with some research center And obviously, one of the research centers I'm thinking of here is the Air Center, who was one of the co-organizers of this particular event, where they've been indeed reaching out to many communities, particularly in South America and also in small island states and Africa, to actually join in and be made aware of some of the projects that they can get involved with in terms of seabed mapping, in terms of biological resources mapping. So get in touch either with via governmental programs or directly with some research centers that are really active in trying indeed to spread out, I would say, the news about some of the projects.
Jen, I would like to add something.
Please.
So just to complement what my colleagues already said, is that one of the winners of this pandemic is the digital transformation. And that means that data is more and more relevant. So I think if we really want to cooperate more and help small islands, we need to discuss data governance and data access. So if we tackle this issue better than in the past and are able also to the countries that are the source of information, because a lot of data is collected in the small islands. If the places where the data is collected also have a word on its use and a win, I think this will help us to have a better post-pandemic. And this is a discussion that is starting or is evolving, but unfortunately is evolving in narrow tables. So we should open more this discussion to the world. So I think if we tackle well data governance in this perfect storm, as it was said, we will give a boost to development.
Thank you, Miguel. That's very, very good. We have one other question from the larger community, just to bring this last one up about deep sea mining, and how does deep sea mining fit into the future of the blue economy? Would anyone like to take that one? Erik, please.
Thank you, Jen. I think that is a very difficult question because I think everybody agrees that there's a lot of controversy around deep sea mining, but there's also huge potential if we get it right. So I won't dive into that debate whether it's right or wrong to do it. I think that International Seabed Authority is doing a brilliant job on getting the stakeholders together. For the first time in human history, we can really regulate an industry before we even have started. So I think that's fascinating in itself. I hope we can get it right because there are enormous resources there, and we can actually have a taxation program, global taxation program of this industry that will benefit developing states. And I think it's also an opportunity to end some of the malpractices of land-based mining. Child labor, social and labor rights breaches, but also environmental spills. Mining is a big source for ocean pollution. Don't forget that. But that said, we then need really to get deep sea mining right so we don't pollute at the deep sea levels. Those minerals will be very, very important for the green shift, for the green transition that we're moving into. And it's also, yet again, an opportunity for new stakeholders, new governments to really have a part of a new industry growing up. So I'm somewhat cautiously positive. It will be a major industry no matter what in 50, 100 years. Remember that the defense industry is one of the industries really that mostly need these rare earth minerals and some of the metals there, and they won't stop for nothing, you know. So that's a huge economic driver to exploit those opportunities. So it's now a window that we can really get this right and make sure that everybody can benefit from that industry when it starts. But it's not given how we get there yet.
Thank you, Erik. another question is, and this is a question that we struggle with at the University of Rhode Island, is, and I hear it in the panel, we're talking about shipping or fisheries or aquaculture. Are there any efforts within your organizations to encourage multi-use? So we hear about offshore wind or offshore renewable energy really accelerating. Is there encouragement for, to be more effective and efficient in using our coasts and oceans and combining offshore wind with, say, aquaculture, or even research, enhancing research and tourism within offshore wind farms, et cetera? But does anyone have any comments about encouraging multi-use strategies versus just to encourage coordination versus that traditional silo approach? Erik, and then Claire?
Yeah, short comment from me. I think we should not only encourage, I think we should demand at least data sharing. The Sustainable Ocean Principles by the UN Global Compact has very clearly defined that all companies should share excess data, non-proprietary data. And I think there is interest to see how we can do multi-industry approach when you have activities in the sea. It's difficult though, of course, because you have different legal authorities regulating and classification of installation and so on. But I think it's a good idea. I think the next sessions coming up later on today on marine spatial planning is the big clue here. That's the key, is to get good roadmap for governments so it's possible to do long-term investments. I think that is one of the big enablers, so that you can have specific areas for wind, aquaculture, fisheries, transport, etc. And it should be connected with land activities and ocean activities. So it's a holistic approach. But I think data sharing is key, and I think it should be mandatory for all ocean-going companies.
Okay.
If I may just add, I do believe that there are indeed quite a number of research programs going on right now in Norway, in Ireland, in the UK, looking at multimodal platforms, whereas you do indeed try to put together different types of activities to actually safeguard, I would say, as much as possible, different parts of the coastline. So you can actually make sure that you get your aquaculture not too far away from your offshore wind farms. And so it's still very much a lot of, I would say, in terms of R&D, it's very R&D intensive. But we're starting to see some projects emerging, some demonstration projects. So as Erik mentioned, I think that that's the way to go. We need to be able to invest more in these innovations and test as much as possible. Because at the end of the day, the ocean seems very, very large, but not that much. It's getting smaller and smaller.
Great. Gregory?
Thanks. I wanted to just piggyback on that in 1 second on the finance side, which is if we look at projects that require finance that have kind of multi-benefits, one of the things that we've been looking at that we haven't figured out completely yet, though, is when you have a port operator that's required to spend vast sums of money on ESG concerns, for example, to replant mangroves or to safeguard mangroves in the area where the plant is being put into place, is there a better way to get more benefits out of that dollar spent? And so we've worked on models before where you create guarantee funds through financial institutions for small fishermen who typically are very constrained with their access to credit to improve their operations. But in return, they need to commit to planting or restoring mangroves in order to be eligible for the credits that would come from that guarantee. I think if all of us could start to think about, if we're having the same objective of protecting that mangrove ecosystem in this case, could we use the money that the ESG is required by the ESG of the port building operation, instead of just putting the money into planting, to fund those kinds of guarantee mechanisms? Then we're getting both the mangrove benefit, the livelihood benefit, the fish stock benefit at the same time. And so, it's something that we're looking at figuring out how to do, and some operators have been interested, but it's very complicated to know when in the cycle to engage on that. But you know, on the I wanted to bring in the finance aspect as well.
That's great. Okay, so this is I am trying to shorten this question, but I don't think I can, so I'm going to read the whole thing. This is from Stuart Bernard. Fisheries and aquaculture as example. We see that fish processing set to grow much, much more than either wild catch or aquaculture from OECD figures. This speaks to the economic importance of adaptive and disruptive supply chains. We scientists tend to focus on biodiversity and environmental variability, but it seems that this is perhaps only a minor but important aspect with economic impact. Any thoughts from the panel?
Yes, I can add
Miguel,
something.
and then Gregory. Thank you.
Yeah, just to say that there is no value chain if there is no a basis. So ecosystem is fundamental. So live beings are fundamental for all process. But we should not forget that we as humans form the society, and the choices we make sometimes impact a lot on these ecosystems. So this is a call to not only study the base, but all the value chain. And we believe that it's possible to take more economic benefits without extracting more. Because if we can, together with aquaculture and also vegetable production and other types of food production, we can create diets that are rich on seafood protein, but saving quantities for others. And also, if we also can avoid on the base the bycatch, we also can save some of the, I would say, fishes and other species from being spoiled by mankind. So if together scientists and economists better productions on the value chain, I think we can solve the problem. And somehow aquaculture has been doing that, but it must do better.
Thank you, Miguel. Gregory?
I think this actually links very nicely back to the question about technology, because one of the investments that was made in the IADB group was in a company called Shellcatch, which was marketing itself as like the Uber of fish, right? And the idea was that purchasers of fish would be able to communicate directly with the fishermen on the boat without the middleman, in order to be able to reduce overfishing, reduce spoilage, so that you didn't have these boats coming back in with too much product or with the wrong product for what was needed in the market. And this started, I believe, in Chile. It's expanded to Mexico and other countries. And the capture of that value chain piece that actually went to the fishermen was, I think, increased by something like 40%. You also had reductions in carbon because the fishermen were not going out as far and staying out as long, because they knew exactly what they were going to be selling to their customers. And so I think that that's a really interesting use of technology to do this. Another is, I think, making these longer term economic cases across the entire value chain. So we saw an example in Mexico where you had a scallop in a bay, where the community knew that if they continued to fish unsustainably, this was going to collapse the business. And the cost actually of, in this case, it was NGOs and others that kind of came in and helped these fishermen find alternate livelihoods for a few years while the population recovered. But they were also working with a larger commercial operation that would process and commercialize these products in the future, making investments in the community. And the amount of money you need to kind of cover the lost wages of that period of time for the community to redevelop, or to respawn, was very small. And so, if you can take this broader view across the entire chain, you're able to put in place these kinds of programs where you could have population increase in a smaller area.
Okay, great. Stuart, I see you. I hope we answered your question. There's one question, and you know, many of you have been talking about the need for a long-term vision or a long-term investment or commitment, and clearly, I know you say that, recognizing that for many communities, nations, that's really difficult, either for political reasons or just the fact that they need to respond to the issue that's on their plate right now, immediately. Is it so? How, as institutions that potentially maybe have more of a luxury in doing that, how would you recommend these nations or communities to really commit or to push that long-term vision or investment? Claire, I saw you unmute, and then Erik and Gregory, right? Okay.
Is that okay? Okay, so what I would suggest is, you're absolutely correct. When we think of this long-term vision, it's very often linked to the industries that we look at sometimes. For the shipping industry, it can take up to 20, 25 years before you actually change your fleet. So when you take a look at either your assets or your infrastructure, ports even, you know, it can be up to 50 years. It takes long-term investments, long-term political will. For a country, there are still a number of levers of economic and legal and regulatory instruments that can be put in place relatively rapidly so that they can actually either boost innovation or they can actually regulate better some of their maritime zones. So at a country level, you can still have a number of instruments put in place relatively rapidly that can actually promote one sector over the other. This is not something that we would push for, but in some cases that may protect some environmental or some ecosystems. So again, it's a give and take situation, but at country level, there are still quite a number of levers that exist in terms of policy, economic, and legal and regulatory instruments that are often not used enough. That's something that we found at the OECD when looking at different ocean economies around the world, I would say.
Thank you, Claire. Erik, I think you were next.
Yeah, I totally agree with Claire. I think there is a lot of unused mechanisms that smaller nations could use and leverage on. And I think there is a real appetite for blended finance, public-private partnerships on these issues, where you have the World Bank system, really AAA rated loans, financing and take risk for some of these infrastructure investments, but also for pooled loans or investments for escape projects. I think there is, but I think they must be aligned with the long-term goal, but they can have short-term objectives, of course, and that's always important to fulfill some of the short-term objectives. Thank you.
Thank you, Erik. And then I think Gregory, did you have something?
Yeah, just very brief. But I think that we as a community have not been great at telling the story of what the benefits are to local populations economically or in terms of livelihoods. And one of the things that we see countries doing is you know, if you're going to put in place a marine protected area, if you're going to support, you know, fishing rights, explaining to the population how that impacts them, how that impacts their income, how that impacts jobs, how that impacts the recovery. Typically is an afterthought in projects, if I'm very honest. And I think that we need to see more of that. Also, going back to the question about universities, and I think that universities can play a big role there in helping to quantify those benefits. But it also goes between this holistic view of getting all of the stakeholders to work together. The stakeholders themselves are not very good at talking to each other. And so, you know, scientists, you know, want to issue a 50-page, a 100-page report, but the CEO of the business wants a 2-page decision memo. And, you know, I spend a lot of my time as like a Rosetta Stone between those different communities. Mm. And I think that the actors themselves need to think about how they're communicating their messages for action, not only to the population who ultimately holds the government accountable and are the ones who put pressure, but also to the other actors in the kind of ecosystem.
Okay. Yeah, it's very difficult. I know it's hard to say, respond to this question and solve it. Miguel, I have a question for you. You mentioned in your presentation about sustainable trade agreements, and that we really need to move towards that. Can you say a little bit more about that? What do you mean by sustainable trade agreements? Can you put some meat around that?
Mm-hmm. For the research we have been doing for more than 10 years, we understand that most of the unbalanced use of the oceans comes from unbalanced trade agreements. And we can see that we also can link to the answer to the question before. So when China decided to have a maritime one Belt, One Road initiative, that was planned. That was a long-term decision, started more than 20 years. And the first evidence was started with the investment in shipbuilding. Then the overload of capability of shipbuilding created a massive capacity of shipping worldwide that low down prices and influenced a lot on how we live today. So this is one example when if we have or not sustainable trade agreements, we are impacted by that. This is one simple example, but we can have many. So what I'm saying is it's not possible to have a sustainable strategy that concentrates a lot of the production of the blue industries in a few countries. And I said China, but that example is not only on China, there are others. So this is time for the good of our planet to start to discuss what are the trade agreements that consider economics, social, environmental, and also culture. So if we are not able to see, the final result is that no one will win. So there will have some quick wins, but at the end of the game, as we are starting to see with the effects of pollution and also extreme climate events, and maybe pandemic, I don't know, something is happening to this planet. So if we, in this crisis, are not able to cool down, set better agreements on the benefit of all, I will not be optimistic on the future. And that involves a lot, academia. And also to complete or to give a contribution to the other question, we need more social scientists on board. I don't see many. So this is a call for action because we also can study human behavior, mankind consumption. And again, the sign on the change of the mix of the seafood consumption was a very good sign. So in fast time, people respond to the crisis by changing a lot their type of consumption. So if that happens, this is a sign that if we do well, we can change the way we consume seafood. But I have other examples, like Norway did it very well when promoted salmon. I'm not saying that entering the discussion if it is sustainable or not in terms of aquaculture production, but Norway was able to increase the consumption of salmon in some decades. So it is possible to change. That is what I'm trying to do if we involve academia and if we invest in long term in these decisions for the good of mankind.